implemented equally or to be effective, to be working truly. And especially in terms of the human rights of some of the most vulnerable, these continue to be ignored, disrespected, breached, which means that these people, including the defenders of minorities, are abused, even at times subjected to violence, and even killed with little consequence for the perpetrators and those responsible. And so, despite the noble intentions and goals contained, for example, in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we run the risk of going backwards in addressing the root causes of violent conflicts, since longstanding grievances of communities, mainly of minorities, and as we've heard time and time again, indigenous peoples, they still run the risk of being disproportionately unaddressed because the human rights dimensions of protecting those most in need of protection, such as minorities, are not working sufficiently or even not working at all. And this injustice creates conditions for potential conflict. Now, as a number, I would say many of you pointed out in different ways, without justice, there is no peace. The second general observation that I wanted to make from your recommendations is that while many of them were general and did not address necessarily specifically the themes that were raised in the four substantive panels of this regional forum, there was, in my view, a clear message. Minorities still feel largely ignored, unprotected, marginalized, and excluded. And the message also that the United Nations and governments are still not doing enough to recognize their marginalization, their particular vulnerability of these groups, ensuring that everyone's human rights are protected equally, and that specifically that the marginalization and vulnerability of these groups need to be addressed and their human rights more clearly set out and protected. I think the message, in a sense, is of the need to focus on the particular targeted yet vulnerable groups if you want to effectively tackle the most serious situations of exclusion, injustice, and discrimination. It's a bit, I think, to make a certain analogy, it is a difference between all lives matters and Black Lives Matters in the United States. Of course, all lives matter, but some lives are more threatened than others, or more vulnerable and subjected to systemic injustice, racism, and discrimination. And unless this unbalance is addressed directly, the necessary measures and focus where they are needed most will not be effectively identified and put into place. I think someone also mentioned that the human rights of minorities must be mainstreamed in the activities of the United Nations and the African Union to help in this evolution. And clearly, right now, it is not. What I also retain from the recommendations is therefore that the United Nations, the African Union, and governments must do more to recognize these vulnerable and marginalized groups, specifically, especially minorities who are often vulnerable to the whims, sometimes prejudices or biases of the majority, or those who are dominant, and offer better recognition, legal protection, and especially the implementation of their human rights, because what we have in place right now is insufficient. And conceptually, there's much that could be said. And I did note that even among some of our panelists, there may not have been always perhaps well understood that we are dealing with the human rights of minorities. And that is the denial of these human rights that are the root causes of often of group-based grievances that can lead to violent conflicts. And this was referred to, as you may remember at the very beginning, this was referred to rather clearly in the United Nations and World Bank study in 2018. So just to be clear, because there was some ambiguity about this at one point, more recent data and studies confirm that most conflicts today are internal armed conflicts. And in most, not all, but most of these conflicts, one of the parties is a minority or could be described as an indigenous peoples group, which again, as the UN World Bank report indicates, that they have grievances of exclusion, injustice, and discrimination, which are not only perceived, but often directly identifiable or connected to discriminatory practices. Neglected here. And once again, which has been referred to benefits of state control. Those are the objects and their unequal distribution, which almost always features one of the most basic human rights, and that is the prohibition of discrimination. But this actually seems to be one of the fundamental dimensions of these conflicts, discrimination in relation to objects of differences between minorities and other segments of the society. I was also pleasantly surprised in the recent evolution that was mentioned just this month, as a matter of fact, in a working group of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which has included the concept of minorities, even if it hasn't been formalized yet in terms of the content, but it has actually recognized, this working group has included into its reach and recognition the concept of minority. And that, I think, will facilitate a much needed dialogue and progress in terms of acknowledging that there are certain groups known as minorities, which objectively can be marginalized and whose human rights tend too often to be neglected. So these are, ladies and gentlemen, some of the central messages which I retain. There are many more, of course. And this is something, by the way, which we have also heard in other parts of the world, and which we'll try to bring together in the final recommendations that we've presented to you for this regional forum, because in the end, it's part of a necessary search for justice and inclusion, if we are to have equality and peace for all, and no one is to be left behind. Let me mention again what I shared with you earlier, that this is just one part of a process with many steps, that the recommendations will be worked on and be used at various stages, including being available for participants at the upcoming UN Forum on Minority Issues in Geneva in December, and hopefully will be used to inspire and contribute to the eventual drafting of practical guidelines or something similar for the United Nations on the prevention of violent conflicts and the protection of the human rights of minorities. I hope that the next two regional forums we'll be holding this year before December, in Asia Pacific in September and in Europe in October, will allow us to contribute more in what is a essential dimension of respecting the human rights of minorities and the reality of most internal armed conflicts around the world, that justice and peace can best be secured and conflicts prevented when the human rights of all of us, but especially of those who tend to be the most marginalized, excluded, and subjected to prejudices and discrimination, are recognized and protected. And as is done also elsewhere around the world, the United Nations and national governments must focus their attention and efforts on those whose human rights are most at work, at risk rather. And as we have seen yesterday and today, these tend to be, well, obviously minorities and also indigenous peoples. There were, however, suggestions made which clearly had no connection with the theme of the regional forum. While we've heard those, we have taken noted the points or situations that were raised, and I'm extremely grateful for you for sharing this information. I would invite you to think of this event as the beginning, not as an end. Consider, for example, some of the regional entities, African Union, African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which were present here, and which may be involved in work which could be the appropriate platform for some of those issues, other issues raised, which did not really deal with the theme of this regional forum. Some of the issues that raise concerns or allegations of violations of human rights of minorities. So as I said this morning, please contact my office at the email address that I did provide in the chat box earlier today so that we can do a follow-up on the matter that you raised, which involve minority human rights. I will now continue in French. Je passe maintenant à la langue française. Il y a bien sûr des recommandations qui sont propres à chaque région. Et on m'indique que vous avez vu que nous avons un nombre qui semble un nombre de recommandations qui n'ont été émises qu'ici. C'est d'ailleurs l'un des objectifs de ces forums régionaux. Vous avez vos propres contextes. Il y a des défis qui vous sont propres, y compris le legs colonial qui a été mentionné maintes fois. Et la meilleure façon d'identifier et de tenir compte de ce contexte, de mieux le comprendre, c'est d'être sur place avec les gens de la région. Non, même s'il est vrai que 2 jours en virtuel.
So we need to organize forums in presential. So I think that we have a series, impressing series of recommendations, very precise, from Africa and the Middle East. So the recommendations that you have seen are your own recommendations, in fact. So I would like to congratulate you for your contribution and all these remarks. Now, congratulations. So I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The organization of this first forum, regional forum for Africa and the Middle East, was only possible thanks to your commitment and sacrifices and lack of sleeping. I'm going to mention now a number of names. I would like to thank to the interpreters who did an excellent work in conditions not always easy. Interpretation is a difficult task, but it is essential. If we would like to be the most accessible possible, we cannot limit ourselves to 1 or 2 languages, European languages. So congratulations for interpreters of the 4 languages of this regional forum: English, Arabic, French, and Portuguese. Many regional entities supported and contributed to the contribution of this regional forum. I'd like to thank in particular the government of Gambia and regional partners of this forum, government, the Global Action Against Mass Crimes of Norway,
Le UNPO, Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, et enfin
And finally, USEC,
on Minorities in the Middle East, qui se trouve au Liban.
which is in Lebanon.
Il ne faut surtout pas oublier
We should not forget the help and the suggestions and the presence of the minority fellows of Lund, who contributed a lot to this regional forum, and I hope they will continue to do it for all the regional forums. There had been the help and the mandatory advice of consulting groups for the regional forums who have been associated to my mandate for the help they provided for the preparation of the 4 regional forums through the world. So thank you. Finally, thanks to all the experts, guests, representatives, the officials of 12 governments who allowed us to better understand the needs of your own needs in the different contexts of Africa and the Middle East. And they contributed also at many levels. And I'd like to thank in particular the presence of Qatar and Gambia for the meeting, a high-level meeting of the states that we had. Thanks to them and to the success of their panel, I think that we will in the future continue this approach for our all regional forums. To the 5 moderators of this regional forum, Madam Hannah, Mrs. Hannah, Mr. Najim Moulay Nasser, Mrs. Dahani, and Fan Rui, Mr. Fatah Hassan, and Mr. Frank O'Keir. A big thank for moderating and your excellent moderation. For all panelists who shared with us the fruit of their experience and expertise, and who equally enriched the content of the recommendations, since all of them, they were asked to provide us with recommendations. Thank you again. You have so made very fruitful, interesting suggestions, and so it's possible that we recourse to you once more during this year. So as I have explained it before, we have just started a long process, which I hope will feed our reflection and efforts for the writing of guidelines for the prevention of conflicts and the better protection of minorities. Finally, next year, by 2022, will be the 30th anniversary of the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. And I invite you already to participate to this debate deeply by next year for the protection of the rights of minorities, for the forum, which will be organized and take place in presential, where we can meet and exchange and learn together. To the members of my team, to Marina and Dick Nong, and to the special advisor, Mortaza, and to the members of the team of the Institute, Tom Lantos, and in particular, Marcus, Nikki, Sean, and Daniela, for their support since 2019, without which the forum would have never taken place. Thank you once more. Finally, for personal reasons, the director of the Institute of Tam Ancos, Anne-Marie Ancos, who couldn't be with us to this forum, but it's really thanks to her leadership and vision that this forum was possible, and all the regional forums that have taken place before. I would like to thank you, deeply thank you, and I hope that the following days and the following days you will be better and we will meet again in person. A big thank for all of you. We have succeeded beyond our expectations. Congratulations. So take care and get ready for the next regional forum in a few weeks. Finally, it's the end. I would like to thank you all. Thank you, you participants, experts, and other guests who are at the heart of this regional forum, with whom I hope we will continue to work together for the better understanding and respecting and setting up the human rights of minorities, including in particular to prevent conflict and to guarantee that minorities are not abandoned, no one left behind, thanks to the respect of their human rights. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Until we meet again à la prochaine, please stay safe and healthy, and I look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye. I now declare the Regional Forum for Africa and the Middle East closed. Au revoir tout le monde.